The city was lit up by streetlights and the signs of busy restaurants. The cold wind cut through the streets, making people huddle in their coats as they walked quickly. Daniel, a successful businessman, straightened his suit as he got out of his car and walked towards one of his favorite restaurants. After a tiring day of meetings, he just wanted a quiet meal before heading home. The restaurant was cozy, with a delicious aroma of freshly prepared food. He chose a table near the window, where he could watch the hustle and bustle of the street. As he waited for his order, his eyes were drawn to a scene outside. A boy, no more than 9 or 10 years old, was leaning against the glass, looking inside with an expression that mixed longing and resignation. His thin face and dirty clothes betrayed his condition. But what caught Daniel's attention the most were the boy's eyes, a look of hunger and hope, as if each dish served inside was an unattainable dream. For a moment, Daniel tried to ignore it. He had seen many scenes like that around the city, but something about that boy bothered him in a different way. The boy took a deep breath and moved away from the glass, putting his hands in the torn pocket of his sweatshirt. He looked around, as if looking for a way to get something to eat. Daniel watched him approach a group of people on the sidewalk, asking for some coins. Most of them ignored him, looking away, pretending not to see. It was then that the boy made a quick decision. In an instant, he approached an outside table, where a customer had forgotten a piece of sandwich on his plate. With a swift movement, he grabbed the sandwich and ran down the street before anyone noticed. Daniel watched the scene with a tightness in his chest. The boy didn't seem to be a common thief. His desperation was evident. Hunger made him act on instinct. Without thinking much, Daniel got up and walked out the door of the restaurant. He looked around and saw the boy quickly turning the corner. He decided to follow him. It wasn't hard to find the boy. He was sitting on the sidewalk, hiding behind a trash can, devouring his sandwich as if it were the best meal of his life. Daniel approached slowly, not wanting to scare him. "Hey, kid," he called in a calm voice. The boy's eyes widened and he froze in place, holding the sandwich tightly, as if he was afraid someone was going to snatch it from his hands. "Don't worry," Daniel said, bending down to the boy's level. "I'm not going to take it away from you." The boy hesitated for a moment, still suspicious. But hunger got the better of him, and he took another bite, chewing quickly. Daniel sighed, watching him. "Do you want to eat something real? A hot meal?" The boy's eyes lit up, but his suspicion remained. I don't have any money. I'll pay," Daniel replied, holding out his hand. "Come with me. Let's go into the restaurant." The boy looked at the outstretched hand. His hesitation lasted a few seconds. Then, slowly, he took Daniel's hand and stood up. Unbeknownst to them, that decision would change their lives forever. The warmth of the restaurant contrasted with the cold night outside. As soon as Daniel and the boy entered, some customers glanced over, without paying much attention. The smell of hot food made the boy's eyes shine. "Sit here," Daniel said, pulling out a chair for him. The boy hesitated for a moment, seemingly in disbelief that this was really happening. He looked around, as if expecting someone to come and kick him out. But when he saw that no one seemed to care, he finally sat down, shrugging his shoulders, as if trying to make himself as small as possible. Daniel took the menu and placed it in front of the boy. "Choose whatever you want." The boy's eyes widened in surprise. His dirty fingers touched the menu carefully, as if he was afraid of tearing it. He flipped through a few pages, but then bit his lower lip nervously. I don't know," he mumbled. "Do you like hamburgers?" Daniel asked with a slight smile. The boy nodded quickly. "Great. Then let's order a large one, with fries and a milkshake. Is that okay?" The sparkle in the boy's eyes was the answer. Daniel called the waiter and placed the order. Meanwhile, he watched the boy, who was looking around, still suspicious. He seemed ready to run away at any moment. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, trying to start a conversation. The boy lowered his gaze and played with the edge of the table, embarrassed. "Matthew," he answered almost in a whisper. "Very good, Matthew. I'm Daniel." The boy just nodded, but didn't say anything else. He kept looking at his hands, as if he didn't know what to do with them. The silence between the two lasted a few seconds, until the waiter returned with the tray. When the plate was placed in front of Matthew, his eyes widened. The boy's eyes widened. He smelled the food and swallowed hard. "You can eat it," Daniel said. Matthias looked at him, as if he wanted to make sure it was real. Then, he took the burger with both hands and took a bite. His eyes closed for a moment, savoring every bite. Daniel watched the scene, feeling a tightness in his chest. The way the boy ate so urgently showed that it had been a long time since he had had a decent meal. "Is it tasty?" he asked. Matthias nodded, still chewing. The businessman waited for the boy to finish eating before speaking again. "You said you don't have any money," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Do you live on the streets?" Matthias swallowed hard and lowered his head. "My mother is in a shelter," he said, his voice low. "I stay around. Sometimes I can sleep there, sometimes I can't." Daniel was silent for a moment. He hadn't expected to hear that. "And your father?" The boy shook his head. "I've never met him. I only have my mother." Daniel took a deep breath. The story of that boy was starting to get even more serious than he imagined. He took a napkin and wiped some of the sauce off Matthias's face in an almost instinctive gesture. The boy looked at him, surprised by his kindness. "Matthias, if I wanted to meet your mother, would you take me to her?" The boy's eyes showed uncertainty. He still didn't know if he could trust Daniel. But something inside him told him that this man wasn't like the others. "Okay, I'll take you." Daniel smiled. He couldn't explain why, but he felt like he needed to do something for that boy. And that night was just the beginning. After finishing his meal, Matthias wiped his mouth with a napkin and looked at Daniel, still unsure of what to expect from that man. He was used to being ignored, treated as if he were invisible. But Daniel seemed different. Outside the restaurant, the cold wind blew hard. Daniel took his coat and put it over the boy's shoulders, who shrugged at the unexpected warmth. "Come on," Daniel said. "Take me to your mother." Matthias nodded and started walking, still suspicious, but now feeling a glimmer of hope. He kept looking around, as if he was afraid someone would try to stop him. "How long have you been in this situation?" Daniel asked, trying to break the silence. Matthias shrugged. "About 6 months, I think. We lived in a small house, but my mother got sick and lost her job. The landlord didn't want to wait for the rent. He threw us out." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. He had heard so many stories like this before, but hearing it straight from a child's mouth made it all the more cruel. "And your father?" Matthias lowered his head. "I never had a father. My mother always said he left before I was born." Daniel was silent for a moment. Something about that story touched him strangely. "How is your mother now?" "Weak. She can barely get out of bed at the shelter. I go out to try to get food, but it doesn't always work out." Daniel sighed. He didn't know exactly what he intended to do, but he felt he couldn't just turn his back on that boy and his mother. After a few minutes of walking through the dark streets, they arrived at the shelter. It was a small, simple building with a few beds lined up in a cramped space. Women sat on makeshift benches, some talking quietly, others just staring into space. Matthias led him to a corner, where a thin woman with messy hair was lying on a thin mattress. Her eyes were half closed, and she looked exhausted. "Mom," Matthias called, approaching. The woman slowly opened her eyes, and upon seeing her son, tried to smile. "Hi, my love. Did you manage to eat anything today?" "I did. This guy helped me." It was then that her eyes met Daniel's. There was a moment of absolute silence. Daniel felt a shiver run through his body. That woman, he felt like he knew her from somewhere. "You," she murmured, trying to sit up, but her weakness wouldn't allow it. Daniel slowly approached. "What's your name?" he asked, almost voiceless. The woman took a deep breath, as if trying to gather strength. "Mariana." Daniel's heart stopped for a moment. That name! It was the name of the woman he loved in the past. The woman who disappeared without a trace. And now there, lying on a mattress, was she. And next to her, the boy who could be her son. Time seemed to stop. Daniel felt his chest tighten. His breathing became irregular. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mariana, there, in front of him. So fragile, so different from the woman he knew in the past. Matthias looked from one to the other, not understanding what was happening. "Do you know my mother?" the boy asked, frowning. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but the words simply wouldn't come out. He stared at Mariana, searching for her, an answer in her eyes. Her gaze held surprise and a bit of shame. "Daniel," she said, her voice weak, almost a whisper. He swallowed hard. How is that possible? What happened to you?" Mariana lowered her eyes and took a deep breath. "I wanted to tell you, but I thought it didn't make sense anymore." "Told you what?" Daniel's voice came out firmer than he expected. His heart was hammering against his chest. Mariana hesitated, looked at Mateus, and then at Daniel. She seemed to be gathering the courage to say something important. "I was pregnant, Daniel, and I was afraid of tying you to me, afraid that you wouldn't want that responsibility. So I left." The confession hit Daniel like a punch in the stomach. His gaze turned to Mateus, who watched them in silence, confused. "You're saying that?" He couldn't finish the sentence. Mariana nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Mateus is your son." Daniel was speechless. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He looked at the boy, searching for similarities he had never noticed before. The shape of his face, the way he frowned. How had he never noticed? Mateus blinked, still trying to understand what was happening. "Do I have a father?" His voice was hesitant. Daniel ran his hand through his hair, trying to organize his thoughts. He felt a whirlwind inside him. Part of him wanted to hug Mateus, hold him, and tell him that everything would be okay. Another part was still processing the fact that he had lost so many years of his son's life without even knowing it. I need to think." That was all he could say. Mariana's gaze showed understanding. She knew it would be a lot to take in at once. Mateus, on the other hand, lowered his head, trying to hide his disappointment. He had waited his whole life for a father, and now that he found out he had one, the reaction was not exactly what he expected. Daniel took a deep breath and looked at Mariana again. "You can't keep living like this." I need to help." The woman nodded slowly. "But not because you feel guilty, Daniel," she said. "Matthew has always been a strong boy, and I did the best I could. Just promise that if you're going to stay in his life, that it's for real." Daniel looked at the boy again, feeling a lump in his throat. "I don't know how to do this, but I promise." Matthew looked up and, for the first time, smiled shyly. What Daniel didn't know was that this promise would change his life forever. The silence between Daniel and Mariana seemed to weigh heavily on the small space of the shelter. Matthew watched the two of them, not fully understanding what was happening, but feeling that something important had changed. Daniel looked around. The place was cramped, with thin mattresses scattered across the floor and little privacy. Some women gave curious glances. Others just stared into space, immersed in their own problems. The smell of mold and exhaustion permeated the air. He couldn't leave them there. "You need to leave this place," he said, finally breaking the silence. Mariana smiled sadly. "And where to go, Daniel?" "I have nowhere to go. The shelter is all we have." Daniel took a deep breath. He wasn't an impulsive man. He liked to plan every step, but at that moment, there was no time for planning. "You're going with me," he decided. Mariana's eyes widened. "What? You can't spend another night here. I have a big, comfortable apartment. I'm not saying it's permanent, but at least until we find a solution, you can stay there." She hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to seem like a burden in his life. But when she looked at Mateus, she saw his eyes shining with expectation. The boy had never slept in a real bed since they were evicted. "I don't know, Daniel," she murmured. Mateus held on to the sleeve of her shirt, as if silently asking her to accept. "Mom, please, just for one night?" Mariana sighed, defeated by her son's hopeful look. "Okay, but only until I can find something better." Daniel nodded. "Deal. Now let's go." Mateus couldn't hide his excitement. He had never driven in a car as beautiful as Daniel's. Sitting in the back seat, he looked at every detail, his eyes shining with admiration. "Are you rich?" he asked, curious. Daniel laughed. "Something like that." The boy smiled broadly. "Cool." Mariana, on the other hand, remained silent, looking out the window. Her mind was restless. After all, Daniel was part of a past she had tried to forget, and now he was here, helping her in a way she never expected. When they arrived at Daniel's apartment, Mateus couldn't believe his eyes. The place was huge, well decorated, and had a clean smell he had never smelled before. "Wow, you live here?" "Yes," Daniel replied, taking off his jacket. "And for today, this house is yours too." Mateus ran to see the rooms, his eyes wide, shining. Mariana observed everything more cautiously. "You didn't have to do this, Daniel." He sighed. "Maybe not, but I wanted to." She remained silent. Deep down, she knew that Daniel was trying to understand all of this, just like she was. Mateus came running back, excited. "Do you have a bed just for me?" Daniel smiled. "Yes, and tomorrow we can buy you some new clothes. What do you think?" The boy nodded frantically, beaming. Mariana, on the other hand, felt uncomfortable. She didn't want to depend on anyone. But, seeing Mateus so happy, she decided to accept. For the first time in months, they would sleep in a warm, safe, and comfortable place. And this was just the first change of many that were to come. That night was the first in a long time that Mateus slept peacefully. The soft bed and clean sheets were a luxury he didn't even know existed. Mariana, however, had trouble falling asleep. She was grateful for the help, but her mind was restless. The next day, the smell of fresh coffee filled the apartment. Mariana woke up and found Daniel in the kitchen, making coffee and toast. The scene seemed strange. Years ago, she would never have imagined that reunion. "Did you sleep well?" Daniel asked, seeing her standing in the doorway. "Yes. Thank you for that," she replied, crossing her arms. He noticed that she looked uncomfortable. Maybe she was trying to understand what his intentions were. "Sit down. Let's talk," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. Mariana hesitated, but obeyed. Daniel sat down in front of her, watching her carefully. "I need to understand," he began. "Why did you leave without telling me you were pregnant?" She lowered her eyes and held the cup with trembling hands. "I was afraid, Daniel. Afraid of tying you to me. Afraid that you wouldn't want that responsibility. We were young, and you had plans. I didn't want to be a burden." "A burden?" Daniel frowned, feeling a pang of indignation. "Mariana, you took away from me the chance to meet my own son." She sighed, clasping her hands together. "I know, and I regret it every day. But after he was born, my life turned upside down. I tried to do the best I could, but everything fell apart when I got sick." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to contain the mix of emotions that were overwhelming him. "Did you ever think about looking for me?" "I did. But when I saw that you were fine, moving on with your life, I thought it would be too late." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. He didn't know whether to feel angry or compassionate. The sound of footsteps interrupted their conversation. Mateus appeared at the kitchen door, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. Daniel forced a smile. "Good morning, champ. Are you hungry?" The boy nodded and sat down at the table. As he devoured the toast, Daniel and Mariana exchanged silent glances. "I have to leave this morning," Daniel said after a while. "But this afternoon, we're going to the mall to buy clothes for you." Mateus's eyes lit up. "Really?" "Yes. You need new clothes, don't you?" The boy smiled excitedly. Mariana, however, felt a lump in her throat. "You don't have to do that, Daniel." He stared at her for a moment and in a firm tone answered, "Yes, I do." She remained silent. For the first time, she realized that Daniel wasn't helping out of obligation, but because he really wanted to. That morning, something changed between them, and Mariana began to realize that maybe, just maybe, Daniel was still a part of her life more than she imagined. The morning passed quickly. Daniel left to take care of some work issues, leaving Mariana and Mateus alone in the apartment. The boy explored everything with curiosity, enchanted by every detail. Mariana, on the other hand, felt uncomfortable. She knew that this wasn't her home and that, at any moment, she would have to leave. In the afternoon, Daniel returned as promised. As soon as he got in, Mateus ran to him, excited. "Are we really going to the mall?" Daniel smiled. "Of course. Let's go right now." The sparkle in Mateus's eyes made Daniel realize how small things could be great for someone who had never had anything. The scene at the mall was almost surreal. Mateus looked at the shop windows, fascinated. He had never set foot in a place like that. "Choose whatever clothes you want," Daniel said. The boy's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" Mariana watched everything in silence. Seeing Mateus happy filled her with gratitude, but also with concern. She didn't want her son to create unrealistic expectations. Daniel could be there now, but what about later? After choosing some clothes, Daniel took them to dinner at a restaurant in the mall. While Mateus ate, Mariana noticed that Daniel was watching her closely. "What's wrong?" she asked, uncomfortable. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Mariana, I still can't believe I spent so many years without knowing that Mateus existed." She looked down. "I already explained, Daniel. I know. But there's something I need to ask." Mariana looked up. "What?" Daniel took something out of his pocket and placed it on the table. It was a small silver bracelet, already worn by time. Mariana's eyes widened. Where did you get this?" "In the car, after I took you home yesterday." Mateus dropped it. "Do you recognize it?" She picked up the bracelet with trembling hands. "I gave this bracelet to someone many years ago," Daniel continued. "To a woman I loved." Mariana swallowed hard. This bracelet, her voice was shaky, was Laura's. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine when he heard that name. "Laura," he repeated, feeling a chill. "Yes, my sister." Daniel's world spun. He blinked a few times, trying to absorb the information. "You're your sister?" Mariana nodded. "Laura was my older sister. She always talked about a boy she loved, but she never knew the truth about what happened." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "And what happened to her?" Mariana's eyes filled with tears. "She died, Daniel. In childbirth." The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "Are you saying that Mateus?" "Yes. Mateus is her son." Daniel felt as if the ground had disappeared. For years, he had lived believing that Laura had abandoned him without explanation. Now, he discovered that not only had she had his child, but that she had also died giving birth to him. He looked at Mateus, who was absent-mindedly playing with a napkin on the table, unaware of the bombshell that had just been dropped. Daniel felt a mixture of pain, guilt, and regret. He had lost Laura, but he still had Mateus, and at that moment, he made a decision. He would never leave his son alone again. Daniel felt his heart racing. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Everything he had believed for years was wrong. Laura never abandoned him. She never chose another life. She died. And the worst part, she died giving birth to a son he never knew existed. He looked at Mateus, still playing with the napkin, oblivious to the truth hanging over him. With each passing second, Daniel felt the weight of guilt becoming unbearable. "Mariana, why didn't you ever tell me this before?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. Mariana lowered her eyes, holding the bracelet between her fingers. "I thought it didn't matter. When Laura died, I promised her that I would take care of Mateus as if he were my own son. I didn't want him to feel abandoned. And when I found you again, I thought it would be too late. But it wasn't too late." Daniel slammed his hand on the table, his voice thick with frustration. A few people in the restaurant looked in their direction, but he didn't care. Mariana took a deep breath. "Would you have believed me, Daniel?" After all this time, he opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She was right. For years, he had closed himself off from the world, building barriers around his heart, believing that Laura had abandoned him of her own free will. If someone had shown up and said he had a son, would he have believed them? He ran his hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the truth crush him. "I need some time to process all of this," he murmured, looking at Mateus again. Mariana nodded. "I understand. But there's one thing you need to know, Daniel. Mateus has always been loved. I did everything I could to give him a decent life. Even when I had nothing," Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "I believe in you. What now? What are you going to do?" He took a deep breath and looked straight into her eyes. "I don't know exactly, but I know one thing. I'm not going to leave Mateus alone." Mariana sighed, as if she had been waiting for that answer. Mateus, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, looked at Daniel and smiled. "That was the best day of my life." Daniel's heart tightened even more. He didn't know how, but he would do everything he could to make sure this was just the first of many happy days for his son. The drive back to the apartment was silent. Mateus dozed in the back seat, exhausted after a day that for him was a dream. Mariana looked out the window, lost in thought, and Daniel, at the wheel, tried to process everything he had discovered. He had a son. For 10 years, he lived without knowing it. While he built his empire, while he closed million-dollar deals, while he believed that Laura had abandoned him, his son grew up without him. When they arrived at the apartment, Daniel picked Mateus up, who was fast asleep, and carried him to the guest room. He tucked the boy in with the same care of a father who had always been there, although only now was he beginning to understand the weight of that role. When he left the room, he found Mariana standing at the door, watching everything. "Are you okay?" she asked. Daniel laughed humorlessly. "How can I be okay? I found out today that I have a 10-year-old son and that I lost the woman I loved, without even knowing the truth." She sighed. "I know it's a lot." He ran his hand over his face, tired. "I don't know what to do, Mariana. I never wanted to have children. I always thought I wouldn't have time, that I wouldn't be good at it. And now, suddenly, I have a son who already exists, who already has a life without me." She leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. "Mateus is an incredible child, Daniel. He doesn't need much. He just needs someone who truly cares." He looked at her, his chest tight. "What if I don't know how to be that someone?" "Then learn." Silence settled between them. Mariana didn't try to convince him anymore. She just let him think about everything. Daniel threw himself on the sofa in the living room, staring at the ceiling. His mind was spinning. Why had life decided to play this trick on him now? But he knew one thing. He had already lost Laura. He wasn't going to lose Mateus too. And the next morning, he would make the decision that would change everything. The sun rose, announcing a new day, but for Daniel, it was more than that. It was a new chapter, an opportunity he couldn't waste. He spent the whole night awake, thinking, trying to understand his place in Mateus's life. But deep down, he already knew the answer. He couldn't just go back to his routine and pretend nothing had happened. When he left the room, he found Mariana in the kitchen, making a simple coffee. She looked up at him, waiting. "Did you sleep?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, but I made my decision." She placed the cup on the table and crossed her arms. "And what is it?" He took a deep breath before answering. "I want you to stay with me." Mariana blinked a few times, surprised. "What?" "I don't want her to go back to that shelter, or to the streets, or anywhere else. I want you here, with me." She stared at him, trying to understand if he was really serious. "Daniel, I appreciate everything you've done, but I can't accept this like this." "Mariana, listen." He came closer, holding her hands. "I lost Laura. I spent years believing that she abandoned me, when in fact, she fought until the very end. I wasn't there for her. But I'm here now, and I won't make the same mistake with Mateus." She looked away, clearly moved. "He'll need time." "Me too," Daniel confessed. "But I'm willing to learn how to be a father." At that moment, a soft noise caught both of their attention. Mateus was standing at the kitchen door, looking at them. "I heard what you said," the boy said quietly. Daniel turned to him. "And what do you think, Mateus? Do you want to stay here?" The boy hesitated for a few seconds. Then, he smiled slightly and ran to Daniel, hugging him tightly. "I've always wanted a father." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, holding back tears. "And now you have one." Mariana watched the scene, touched. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe without fear of tomorrow. They didn't know what the future held. But one thing was certain, they were together. And for the first time, Daniel understood that true wealth was not in his bank account, but in the family he had just found.